on YouTube. It's your guy Sports Live, broadcasting live today, January 16th, 2026. Today, we are going to do a live stream dealing with gymnastics. We're going to look at who is going to be competing where in the gymnastics meets. We're going to look at uh, college basketball, men and women's games today. We're going to look at the NBA G League. We're going to look at the regular NBA. We're going to look at NHL hockey and other hockey matches and make picks for who we think will or who I think will win those games. And then thing that I want to talk about. So let's get into this today. So shall we? Anyway, for gymnastics purposes, there are a few gymnastics meets today. Today, January 16th, you have Gustavus Adolphus and the University of Wisconsin EAU Clare at Winona State. You have Greenville at the University of Wisconsin La Crosse. You have Alabama at Florida. You have LSU at Georgia. You have Penn State at Illinois. You have Arizona State at Kentucky. You have Arizona and Denver at Texas Women's. Let's see. You have the Windy City Invite, which is going to include Centenary, Fisk, Illinois State, Southeast Missouri, and Wilberforce. You have Boise State versus BYU, Oklahoma at Missouri, and you have Sacramento State at Oregon State. There's your gymnastics meets. Now, we're going to look at the hockey stuff. So in NHL hockey today, you have San Jose versus Detroit. You have Florida versus Carolina. You have Tampa Bay versus St. Louis, Nashville versus Colorado, and Anaheim versus Los Angeles. So my picks for those games are as follows. I have Detroit beating San Jose. I have Carolina defeating Florida. I have St. Louis defeating Tampa Bay. I have Nashville defeating Colorado. I have Anaheim defeating Los Angeles. And that's in the NHL world of things. Now, let's look and see what else we have. Yes, we just went over that. So, in the NCAA women's hockey today, you have Wisconsin versus St. Thomas in Minnesota. You have Ohio State versus Minnesota State. You have Minnesota versus Bermuda State. You have Penn State versus Syracuse. You have UConn versus Merrimack. You have Dartmouth versus Quinnipiac. And you have St. Cloud. Let's see. You have St. Cloud versus Minnesota and Duluth. You have Harvard versus Princeton. You have Cornell versus Brown. Let's see. Rensselaer versus Clarkson, Colgate versus Yale, Providence versus Boston College, Stonehill versus Sacred Heart, Assumption versus LIU, Delaware versus Lindenwood, Union versus St. Lawrence, one versus St. Michael's. So in those games, here are my picks for who I think will win those games. Can y'all hear me out there in YouTube land? Anyway, I have Wisconsin defeating St. Thomas in Minnesota. I have Ohio State defeating Minnesota State. I have Minnesota defeating Bermuda State. I have Penn State defeating Syracuse. I have UConn defeating Merrimack. I have Quinnipiac defeating Dartmouth. I have St. Cloud defeating Minnesota Duluth. I have Harvard defeating Princeton. I have Cornell defeating Brown. I have Clarkson defeating Rensselaer. I have Yale defeating Colgate. Providence defeats Boston College. Stonehill will defeat Sacred Heart. Assumption will defeat Lindenwood. Union will defeat St. Lawrence. Mercyhurst will defeat RIT. Maine will defeat Vermont. Post will defeat Franklin Pierce. St. Michael's will defeat St. Anselm. That's your women's NCAA hockey. So next we have men's NCAA hockey, and we have some games with it as well. We're just making picks right now, or I'm making picks based on what I know on the sport. So let's. Okay, so I'm sorry about this. Let me get. I'm just trying to get my notes organized. There we go. All right, so I'm going to go over who's playing, and then I'll make my picks. You have RIT versus Canisius. You have Princeton versus Cornell. You have Union versus New York. I'm sorry, Union in New York versus Brown. You have Providence versus Boston College. You have Air Force versus Holy Cross. You have Robert Morris versus Army and West Point. Let's see. Next we have St. Lawrence versus Harvard. I have Niagara versus Mercyhurst. Dartmouth versus Clarkson. Notre Dame versus Penn State. Quinnipiac versus Colgate. Boston University versus UMass and Lowell. Northeastern versus New Hampshire. Merrimack versus Massachusetts. Vermont versus Yukon. Yale versus Rensselaer. There's Bowling Green versus Lake Superior State. Sacred Heart versus Bentley. Omaha versus. Then we have Michigan versus Minnesota. Minnesota Duluth versus St. Cloud State. Michigan State versus Wisconsin. Denver versus North Dakota. Bemidji State versus St. Thomas in Minnesota. Ferris State versus Augustana in South Dakota. You have Stonehill versus Lindenwood, and Alaska Anchorage versus Alaska and Fairbanks. So, with these hockey matches, I have Alaska and Anchorage defeating Alaska and Fairbanks. I have Stonehill defeating Lindenwood. St. Thomas, Minnesota defeating Bemidji State. Ferris State defeating Augustana. I have Denver defeating North Dakota. Michigan State to defeat Wisconsin. Michigan to defeat Minnesota. Minnesota and Duluth to defeat St. Cloud State. Let's see. I have Omaha defeating Miami and Ohio. I'm sorry, Miami and Ohio defeats Omaha. Sorry. I have Minnesota State defeating Michigan Tech. I have Sacred Heart defeating Bentley. Bowling Green defeating Lake Superior State. Yukon defeating Vermont. Yale defeating Rensselaer. Merrimack again, Yukon defeats Vermont. Northeastern will defeat New Hampshire. Quinnipiac will defeat Colgate. Boston University will defeat UMass and Lowell. Notre Dame will defeat Penn State. Dartmouth defeats Clarkson. Harvard defeats St. Lawrence. And Niagara will defeat Mercyhurst. Next, I have RIT defeating Canisius. I have Cornell defeating Princeton. Union in New York defeating Brown. Providence defeating Boston College. Air Force defeating Holy Cross. And Army and West Point defeating Robert Morris. All right, now we have there's several other hockey things, so just bear with me on that one. So, all right, we're going to look at the ACHA hockey, women's hockey, Division 1, and the games on it. And I'm just going to go through them, and then I'll tell you who I think is going to win. Maryville University versus Michigan, and this is most likely club hockey. This is not like NCAA. Sorry. We're going to go University of Michigan and Dearborn versus Michigan State University. I have Salt College versus Niagara University. I have University of Massachusetts in Amherst versus McKendree University. University of Wyoming versus Aquinas College. Lake Superior State University versus Arizona State versus Minot State University. University of Utah versus Montana State University. Yeah, okay. So now I'm going to go through it. Let me see, do I have any others? Yeah, let me go through that real quick. This is in women, so I have Michigan defeating Maryville. I have Niagara defeating Adrian. I have I have Niagara University defeating. Oh wait, no. I have Michigan State defeating the University of Michigan in Dearborn. I have Salt College defeating Niagara University. I have McKendree defeating University of Massachusetts Amherst. I have the University of Aquinas College, Lake Superior State University to defeat Arizona State. I have Lindenwood defeating Maryville University. I have Minot State defeating Indiana Tech, and I have the University of Utah defeating Montana State. That is the ACHA 2 matches. You have Lawrence Technology University versus Aurora University, West Virginia versus High Point, and Hope College versus Central Michigan. I have Aurora beating Lawrence Technological University. I have West Virginia defeating High Point, and I have Central Michigan defeating Hope College. And that was the ACHA Women's Division 2 hockey. Now, let's look at the division. We're going to look at the ACHA Division 1 for hockey. There's a lot of games on here. Well, actually, not a lot, but still some. Anyway, we have Stony Brook University versus Colorado State University. I have Mercyhurst University versus Rochester Institute. University of Pittsburgh versus the University of Ohio. West Virginia University versus Rutgers. Cleary University versus Indiana Tech. Lawrence Tech versus Aquinas College. Western Michigan University versus University of Toledo. Canisius University versus Kent State. Adrian College versus Hope College. Davenport University versus Grand Valley State. Grand Canyon University versus the University of Delaware. The University of Illinois versus the University of Oklahoma. Saginaw Valley State University versus Rochester Christian. Purdue University Northwest versus Calvin University. You have Northwood University versus Roosevelt University. Temple University versus William Patterson University. Towson University versus George Mason University. You have Illinois State University versus Iowa State University versus Minot State University. University of Rhode Island versus Westchester University. United States Naval Academy versus North Carolina State. You have Syracuse University versus Robert Morris University. Northern Illinois University versus McKendree University. I have Stony Brook versus Colorado State. Villanova versus John Carroll. On that page of games, I'm going to go John Carroll over Villanova, Stony Brook over Colorado State, Syracuse over Robert Morris, United States Naval Academy versus over North Carolina State. I have Westchester University defeating the Rhode Island, Midland University to defeat Minot State, Iowa State to defeat Illinois State, Towson will defeat George Mason, William Patterson, I have them defeating Temple, Northwood defeats Roosevelt, Purdue University will defeat Calvin, Rochester Christian will defeat Saginaw Valley State, University of Illinois will defeat will lose to the University of Oklahoma, the University of Delaware will lose to Grand Canyon, Davenport wins over Grand Valley State, Adrian College will defeat Hope College, Canisius will defeat Kent State, Western Michigan will defeat University of Toledo, Aquinas College will defeat Lawrence Tech, Indiana Tech will defeat Cleary, Rutgers will defeat West Virginia, Ohio University will defeat Pittsburgh, Mercyhurst will defeat Rochester, Colorado State will defeat Stony Brook, And let's see, we got a couple more in Division One. Let's see. There's Arizona versus Arizona State, Indiana University of Pennsylvania versus Drexel, Michigan and Flint versus Cincinnati. You have the University of Mary versus Colorado. You have Alabama versus Oregon. And in those games that are taking Alabama, Colorado defeating Mary. Cincinnati will defeat Michigan and Flint. Let's see, Drexel will defeat Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Arizona will defeat Arizona State. So that was the ACHA Division One picks. Now let's look at the ACHA Men's Hockey Division Two. You have Hope College versus Central Michigan, Lawrence Technological University versus Aurora, and West Virginia versus High Point. In this one, I have High Point beating West Virginia. I have Aurora defeating Lawrence Technological University. I have Central Michigan defeating Hope College. And that is Division 2 of the ACHA. Now, let's look at Division 3 matches for the ACHA. Let's see. I made picks on these. So, yeah, you have Lawrence Tech versus Calvin. I have the University of Missouri versus Lewis. Akron versus Florida Gulf Coast. Southern Maine versus Bates College. Florida Southern versus Florida Atlantic. West Virginia versus Butler. Penn State versus Pittsburgh. In those games, I have Penn State defeating Pittsburgh. Butler defeating West Virginia. Florida Atlantic beating Florida Southern. Bates College beating Southern Maine. Akron defeating Florida Gulf Coast. St. Louis will defeat Lewis. Missouri will defeat Ole Miss. And Lawrence Tech will defeat Calvin. Okay, now let's go into a little further. We've got some games on that's going on today. I have Cincinnati versus Purdue. I have Nebraska versus Arkansas. Bradley versus Olivet Nazarene. Drexel versus Kutztown. Ferris State versus Oakland. University of Central Florida versus South Carolina. Austin Peay versus Kennesaw State. Xavier versus Miami University. University of California, Davis versus Nevada. Dordt University versus Nebraska. And let's see, Santa Clara versus the University of California. I have, Northern Arizona versus Arizona State. Washington versus Marion. Indiana versus Tryon. And Miami versus Xavier. Let's see. So Santa Clara, I have them beating California. I have Indiana defeating Tryon. I have Miami defeating Xavier. Marion will lose to Washington. Northern Arizona will defeat Arizona State. Dordt will defeat Nevada. Xavier will defeat Miami University. Kennesaw State will defeat Austin Peay. Central Florida will defeat South Carolina. Oakland University will lose to Ferris State. Drexel will defeat Kutztown. Olivet Nazarene will defeat Bradley. Nebraska will defeat Arkansas. Cincinnati will defeat Purdue. That is your ACHA Division III men's. Right, now in AHL hockey, you have Utica versus Lyral. You have Rochester versus Belleville, Manitoba versus Laval, Rockford versus Grand Rapids, Let's see. Bridgeport versus Lehigh Valley. Hartford versus Wilkes-Barre. Scranton. Chicago versus Milwaukee. Toronto versus Iowa. San Jose, Abbotsford versus San Diego. So in those games, I have Syracuse defeating Utica, Rochester defeating Belleville, Manitoba defeats Laval, Grand Rapids will defeat Rockford, Bridgeport will defeat Lehigh Valley, Hartford will defeat Wilkes-Barre and Scranton, Milwaukee will defeat Chicago, Toronto defeats Iowa, Tucson defeats San Jose, let's see, Calgary defeats Bakersfield, and Abbotsford will defeat San Diego. In ECHL hockey, you have Indy versus Kalamazoo, Troy Rivieras versus Adirondack, Idaho versus Orlando, Greenville versus Reading, Wheeling versus Norfolk, Savannah versus South Carolina, Worcester versus Maine, Jacksonville versus Florida, Rapid City versus Cincinnati, Bloomington versus Fort Wayne, Toledo versus Iowa, Tahoe versus Wichita, Allen versus Tulsa, Kansas City versus Utah. So in the ECHL, my picks are as follows. Kalamazoo will defeat Indy. Adirondack will defeat Troy Rivieras. Idaho will defeat Orlando. Greenville will defeat Reading. Norfolk will defeat Wheeling. Savannah defeats South Carolina. Maine defeats Worcester. Florida will defeat Jacksonville. Rapid City will defeat Cincinnati. Fort Wayne will defeat Bloomington. Toledo will defeat Iowa. Tahoe will defeat Wichita. Tulsa will defeat Allen. Utah will defeat Kansas City. In the Professional Women's Hockey League, you have Minnesota versus New York, and I have New York to defeat Minnesota. In FPHL hockey, you have Watertown versus Binghamton. You have Baton Rouge versus Topeka. Danbury versus Port Huron. Monroe versus Biloxi, Athens versus DD, Twin City versus Riverdale, Columbus versus Indiana. In those games, I have Indiana defeating Columbus, Twin City defeating Riverdale, Athens defeating DD, Monroe defeats Biloxi, Port Huron defeats Danbury, Topeka defeats Baton Rouge, Binghamton beats Watertown. In SPA, Lafayette versus Roanoke, Huntsville versus Knoxville, Evansville versus Pensacola, and Peoria versus Quad City. In those games, I have Quad City defeating Peoria, Evansville defeating Pensacola, Huntsville defeats Knoxville, Roanoke defeats Fayetteville, Birmingham defeats Macon. Let's see. I have NAHL hockey. Maryland versus New Jersey, Johnstown versus Elmira, New Hampshire versus Rochester, Philadelphia versus Maine, Odessa versus Oklahoma, Watertown versus St. Cloud, Minnesota versus Chippewa, Wisconsin versus Springfield, Minot versus North Iowa, Corpus Christi versus Amarillo, Austin versus Bismarck, Minnesota versus Aberdeen, New Mexico versus Lone Star, Shreveport versus El Paso, Fairbanks versus Anchorage, Janesville versus Kenai River. So in those matches, I have New Jersey defeating Maryland, Johnstown defeats Elmira, New Hampshire defeats Rochester, Maine will defeat Philadelphia, Oklahoma will defeat Odessa, St. Cloud will defeat Watertown, Minnesota will defeat Chippewa, Wisconsin will defeat Springfield, Minot will defeat North Iowa, Corpus Christi will defeat Amarillo, Austin will lose to Bismarck, and Corpus Christi will lose to Amarillo. Minnesota will defeat Aberdeen. New Mexico will defeat the Lone Star. Let's see. Shreveport loses to El Paso. Fairbanks will win over Anchorage. Janesville will defeat the Kenai River. So that's all of the hockey that we have going on today. So now let's look at some of the basketball stuff that's going on. In men's college basketball, there's not a lot going on today, but you have Creighton versus Providence, Toledo versus Kent State, Baylor versus Kansas, Loyola Chicago versus Dayton, Marquette versus DePaul, Ohio University versus Ball State, Colorado State versus Boise State. In those, I have Providence to defeat Creighton, Toledo loses to Kent State, Baylor beats Kansas, Dayton defeats Loyola Chicago, DePaul will defeat Marquette, Ohio University defeats Ball State, Boise State defeats Colorado State. All right, now let's look at women's college basketball. And again, not very many games going on with the women's college basketball world today. But we have Stony Brook versus Hofstra, UIC versus Evansville, Bradley versus Drake, UTSA versus Florida Atlantic, Campbell versus Northeastern, Elon versus UNC Wilmington, Hampton versus William and Mary, Drexel versus Charleston, Monmouth versus Towson. In those games, I have Stony Brook defeating Hofstra, Evansville defeats UIC, Drake will defeat Bradley, UTSA defeats Florida Atlantic, Northeastern I expect to beat Campbell, Elon will lose to UNC Wilmington, Hampton will defeat William and Mary, Charleston will defeat Drexel, and Monmouth will defeat Towson. So there you have it. That's the men and women's college basketball. Next, we're going to look at NBA games that are scheduled for today. You have New Orleans versus Indiana. Let's see. You have Cleveland versus Philadelphia, Chicago versus Brooklyn, the Los Angeles Clippers versus Toronto, Minnesota versus Houston, Washington versus Sacramento. In those games, I have Indiana defeating New Orleans. I have Philadelphia defeating Cleveland. I have Chicago defeating Brooklyn. The Los Angeles Clippers will beat Toronto. Houston will defeat Minnesota. And Sacramento will defeat Washington. Now we have a couple of NBA G League games. You have Delaware versus College Park, Maine versus Wisconsin, and Oklahoma City versus Rip City. In that, I have College Park defeating Delaware, Wisconsin defeating Maine, and Oklahoma City to defeat Rip City. In other sports news, FBS coaches vote unanimously to adjust football as a sport redshirt rule. On January 13th, 2026, college football coaches voted to adjust the redshirt rule to allow players to participate in up to 9 games, including playoffs, while preserving a full year of eligibility. This vote took place during the annual convention of the American Football Coaches, Association. The current rule allows only 4 regular season games plus playoffs games. To maintain the red shirt, this potential rule change would still need to be approved from the NCAA Division I committee. Dabo Swinney, the head coach for Clemson, had this to say regarding the matter. The changes to the redshirt rule are indeed as a way to keep more players engaged and disincentivize mid-year opt-outs. Also, since we're talking other sports, longevity is still becoming a big thing in the NFL. So here are the longest tenured coaches in NFL history. Lee Lambeau, 29 seasons. He was coached there from 1921 to 1949. Tom Landry, 29 seasons from 1960 to 1988. Don Shula, 26 seasons from 1970 to 1995. Bill Belichick, 24 seasons, 2000 to 2023. Chuck Noll, 23 seasons, 1969 to 1991. Steve Owen, 23 seasons, 1931 to 1953. The current longest at the helm as a tenured coach for the NFL for consecutive years with one team now is Andy Reid, 13 years, and he's been with the Chiefs. This after recent firings and the one who stepped down on his own. All right, moving on to the next sport of things to discuss. Let's see, the 2026 World Baseball Classic will take place March 5th through 17th of 2026. Games will be played in Miami, Florida, Houston, Texas, San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Tokyo, Japan. It will start in pool games. The top two teams from each of the pools will move to the quarterfinal round. There'll be that's 20 total teams. So in Pool A, you have Puerto Rico, Cuba, Canada, Panama, and Colombia. Pool B is the United States, Mexico, Italy, Great Britain, and Brazil. Pool C is Japan, Australia, South Korea, Czechia, and Chinese Taipei. Pool D is Venezuela, Dominican Republic, Netherlands, Israel, and Nicaragua. The quarterfinals will be March 13th through 14th. The semifinals will be March 15th and 16th. The championship game will be March 17th. In pool play, each team will play 4 games for each pool they represent. And this would represent 10 total games, so 40 games total. Let's break down who it is. Pool A, you have game 1. Game 1 and game 2 will be March 6th. Game 3 and 4 will be March 7th. Game 5 will be March 8th. And game 6 will be March 8th. Game 7 and 8 will be March 9th. Game 9 will be March 10th. And game 10 will be March 11th. And that is standard for all of the pools. So let's look and see who will be playing in each of the pool games. Game 1, Cuba versus Panama. Game 2, Puerto Rico versus Colombia. Game 3, Colombia versus Canada. Game 4, Panama versus Puerto Rico. Game 5, Colombia versus Cuba. Game 6, Panama versus Canada. Game 7, Colombia versus Panama. Game Puerto Rico. Game 9, Canada versus Puerto Rico. And Game 10, Canada versus Cuba. So in all A, B, C, and D, all games are mentioned and will be on those days that I mentioned. So in Pool B, Game 1 will be Mexico versus Great Britain. Game 2 will be the United States versus Brazil. Game 3, Brazil versus Italy. Game 4, Great Britain versus the United States. Game 5, Great Britain versus Italy. Game 6, Brazil versus Mexico. Game 7, Brazil versus Great Britain. Game 8, Mexico versus the United States. Game 9, Italy versus the United States. Game 10, Italy versus Mexico. In Pool C, again, the dates are all the same for pool play for every pool. So in Pool C, Game 1 will be Chinese Taipei versus Australia. Game 2 will be Czechia versus Korea. Game 3 will be Australia versus Czechia. Game 4 will be Japan versus Chinese Taipei. Game 5 will be Chinese Taipei versus Czechia. Game 6 will be Korea versus Japan. Game 7 will be Chinese Taipei versus Korea. Game 8 will be Australia versus Japan. Game 9 will be Korea versus Australia. Game 10 will be Czechia versus Japan. In Pool D, again, the games will all be played the same days for all 4 pools. Game 1 will be Netherlands versus Venezuela. Game 2 will be Nicaragua versus Dominican Republic. Game 3 will be Nicaragua versus Netherlands. Game 4 will be Israel versus Venezuela. Game 5 will be Netherlands versus Dominican Republic. Game 6 will be Nicaragua versus Israel. Game 7 will be the Dominican Republic versus Israel. Game 8 will be Venezuela versus Nicaragua. Game 9 will be Israel versus the Netherlands. Game 10 will be the Dominican Republic versus somebody. I don't have that. The bracket rounds of the World Baseball Classic will be single elimination, meaning if you win, you advance, you lose, you go home. In determining who will play in the quarterfinals, it will be runner-up in Pool C versus the winner of Pool D. The runner-up in Pool A versus the winner of Pool B. The runner-up in Pool B versus the winner in Pool A. Runner-up in Pool D versus the winner in Pool C. Let's see. And also in that, the top 2 winners, the quarterfinals will be based on the top 2 winners from each of the pools. The winners of the quarterfinals will play in the semifinal. The semifinal winners will play for the World Baseball Classic Championship. Preceding this World Baseball Classic, friendly competitions will take place among countries involved. As it gets closer to main event, these countries will play exhibition games as part of spring training games with Major League Baseball games. To win the World Baseball Classic, a total of 7 games would need to be played, from pool play to bracket play. Before the tournaments begin before the tournament begins, each team in March will play 2 games as a way to warm up. Now, this is a subject of discussion that just caught my attention last night. But in the Alabama State Legislature, we have a political issue coming up regarding high school sports in the state of Alabama. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize what this bill is going to do, and then I'm going to read the actual first draft of the bill word for word, so that way you can get an idea of what's going on. And again, this has not been approved yet. This is only going through the first reading in the Senate. So we have Alabama Senate Bill 73. According to the summary, it says the new bill would take control of Alabama high school sports. There are 3 main points in this. Number 1, schools cannot join the Alabama High School Athletic Association unless governor legislative appointees control the board. And in that, 4 appointees will be by the governor, 4 appointees by the Speaker of the House, 4 appointees by the Senate President pro temp, and 3 appointees by the Lieutenant Governor. Number 2, the summary is, can't enforce any eligibility rules without public review under the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, which includes eligibility decisions, transfer rules, recruiting rules, in-season bans, and appeals. Legislature can approve alternate athletic associations if they follow the same rules as Alabama High School Athletic Association. This act would take power away from the Alabama High School Athletic Association and give state politicians major authority over Alabama high school sports. Once everything goes through and everything, this is not going to go for a public vote, but it will go into effect starting October 1st of 2026. Now, this bill was introduced by Connie Chastain, Alabama State Senate District 29, and by Chris Elliott, State Senator District 32 from the Alabama State Senate. District 29, Steve Geneva, he works and serves Geneva County and portions of Dale and Houston counties in Alabama. District 32, for Steve Baldwin for District 32 will serve all of Baldwin County. In this bill, it was the first reading of the bill. It came on January 13th, 2026. Pending further action in the Senate Committee on Education Policy, it was referred to the committee for consideration. The committee has to vote on it in a favorable recommendation before it can proceed to a second reading and a potential vote by the full Senate. Alabama Senate has 35 members. In order for it to pass, the Senate in Alabama would need 18 votes for general bills like this to get a majority of quorum. If it was a constitutional amendment, which it is not, it would have to have 60% vote or 21, which is basically 3/5. If the Senate passes the bill, it is sent to the Alabama State House of Representatives, where it would go through the same process of Senate, and it must pass in identical form for it to go to the governor to sign or to be vetoed. So, let's see. Also, before I read the bill word for word, in the Alabama State House of Representatives, 105 members total. In a general bill, you would need to maintain quorum of 53 votes. If it's a constitutional amendment, which it is not, you will have to have 3/5 of a vote or 63 votes, and some, depending on the special mandate, it would need 2/3 of the vote. So if the governor vetoes the bill, then 53 representatives and 18 senators can try again to override the veto. Now, let's read the bill on what's coming with this. A synopsis. This bill would prohibit public K through 12 schools from being a member of an athletic association whose governing body is comprised of certain members and that enforces rules relating to student athletes' eligibility, which were not adopted in accordance with the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act. This bill would authorize the legislative council to allow any entity to voluntarily adopt rules pursuant to the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act. A bill to be entitled an act relating to public K through 12 schools athletics to prohibit schools from being a member of an athletic association whose board is not of a certain composition and that enforces certain rules not adopted in accordance with the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, and to authorize the legislative council to allow an entity to voluntarily adopt rules pursuant to the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act. Be it enacted by the legislature of Alabama, Section 1A, for purposes of this section, the term quote, athletic association has that same meaning as provided in Section 16-1-52.1 Code of Alabama 1975. B. A public K through 12 school may not be a member of an athletic association unless the association's governing body, including a central board of control, is comprised of at least 50% of members who are appointed by the governor, Speaker of the House of Representatives, President pro tempore of the Senate, or the Lieutenant Governor, including four members who are appointed by the governor, 4 members who are appointed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, 4 members who are appointed by the President pro temp of the Senate, and 3 members who are appointed by the Lieutenant Governor. C. A public K through 12 school may not be a member of an athletic association that enforces a rule, regulation, bylaw, or other directive relating to the eligibility of student athletes to participate in athletics, which was not adopted in accordance with the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, Chapter 22 of Title 41, Code of Alabama, 1975. Section 2. The legislative council may authorize any entity to voluntarily adopt rules pursuant to the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, Chapter 22 of Title 41, Code of Alabama, 1975. Section 3. This act shall become effective on October 1st of 2026. That's if it passes. So there you have it. That is a Senate Bill 73 in the state of Alabama. And in that, it is going to give full control of Alabama high school sports, along with the Alabama High School Athletic Association, to the central and the Senate pro temp. So it will take complete control of high school sports in Alabama if this passes. And the first reading of that bill took place on January 13th. It still has to go through different things, but that is on the agenda for this legislative session, and it will affect high school sports in the state of Alabama. Also, we've just gone over all the hockey games, college basketball. We had men and women's college basketball. We had NBA basketball. We had NBA G League, and then we had the National Hockey League and a variety of other hockey leagues regarding their sports. So, does anybody have any questions, comments regarding all the things we've talked about today? I know it's a lot to take in, but that's what's going on in the sports world today. I wish to thank each and every one of you for joining me today for this broadcast. It is greatly appreciated. If you will, please hit the like button, please hit the subscribe button, please hit the notification bell so you can be made aware of when I am broadcasting live, when I have sports action videos, when I have sports education videos. Again, when I broadcast live, or when I have breaking news in the sports world. If you wish to subscribe to the channel, it is greatly appreciated. You can do so by going to www.youtube.com, the slash symbol, the at symbol, SPORTSL, Sports Love Media as two words, SPORTSLOVMEDIA. You'll know it's me because I'll have Sports Love Media birded to a basketball as my avatar. I'm also on Twitter X. My handle there is at BobAmin16. That is at BOBAMIN16. With this, thank you for tuning in today. Sports Love Media signing out. I hope